Good to go.
Oh, all right. Well, I guess I want to talk about my album and how I made it and why I made it. It's now been a couple of months since it's finished. It's all wrapped up, at least the music part's finished. And when the album began, it began as a research project, asking the question, what would happen if I digitally reversed the sound of some solo piano tracks? And then, so I was experimenting with some reverse audio techniques inside my digital audio workstation, and I really felt attached and felt drawn to the sound of reverse piano, because when you play a piano, the hammer strikes the string and there's this like initial moment of attack, and then the sound kind of decays. And then, so if you think about doing that with one note, when you reverse that process, instead of decaying, the sound emerges and it gains to its loudest point, and then it suddenly cuts off. And so that was like even just on the level of one note, it's sort of like an elevated way of interacting with a sound wave that you've only ever experienced the other way around. And then when you think about adding harmonies and patterns of notes and movement, when you digitally reverse that, the sound, again, it emerges and it doesn't decay. And the other beautiful thing that happens is it's not only the notes that you're pressing that have this experience happening, it's also all of the overtone series, all of the harmonic frequencies that are created by the chord that you play. Those also decay, and they decay proportionally to their size. So if you think about it, when you sing a tone and then you have all of these overtone series that you hear, normally with a piano, those happen all at once and then they start to fade away. And when you reverse that chord, what happens is the chord harmonies build up, and then all of a sudden the overtones start piling onward. And even if you can't hear them or you can't notice hearing them, it provides this like overwhelming sense of arriving somewhere, culminating somewhere, and kind of, in a way that the piano regularly acoustically doesn't create. Mm-hmm. And so I did these experiments, and I listened to what it created, and I used I changed the order. So I visited some of my early compositions for solo piano, and I reversed them, and then I cut them up, and I changed the order to try and give more shape and structure and more sort of narrative flow to these reversed pieces. But I was still kind of dissatisfied with the overall delivery. It still sort of sounded a little bit like music nerds music, which I'm a music nerd, so I liked the way that it sounded. But I also am very passionate about creating things that can find lots of people, regardless of their level of education in music or their experience as musicians themselves. Like, I want to be able to make something that can reach my kid brother as well as my friends who do musicology PhDs. So my idea was to add strings on top of the sound, because I had this notion that you can bow strings to sound a similar way, give a similar timbre and texture to the reverse piano. And so I applied for a Canada Council research grant to sort of explore this process. And then as I was waiting to hear about that grant, I lost my dad very suddenly to suicide. And so then all of a sudden, all of this creating that I had been doing on a level of intellect, ideas, sort of like brain creating, it all of a sudden became the process by which I did all of my heart creating as well. And I had to start putting the emotions that I was experiencing, the sense of interruption and despair and reflection and grief, mostly grief. I had to put it somewhere. And I'm someone who has learned to use music as the way I process my emotions. And so this project of adding strings to digitally reversed piano all of a sudden became very personal and meaningful, and about expressing emotion as much as about expressing an idea or an investigation into music theory. So I want to talk more with Devin about this later, but as I realized that what I was doing was more than just a research grant, I realized what I was doing was creating music to tell a story. And the story that I kept being drawn to was the myth of Icarus and Daedalus. And so that myth, if you're familiar with it, it goes, Icarus and Daedalus are trapped on a labyrinth, and Daedalus is the inventor who constructed the labyrinth. And they've been trapped there, and so Daedalus creates this set of wax wings for him and his son so that they can fly to freedom. And the original myth has it where at the beginning, Daedalus admonishes Icarus and says, he warns him, and he says, you can't fly too high, otherwise the sun will melt the wax of the wings. And you can't fly too low, otherwise the spray of the ocean will wet your wings and they'll stop working and you'll fall and die. And so in the original myth, they set out, and Icarus is sort of overcome by youthful hubris and this sense of immortality. And so he flies too high and his wings melt and he falls into the ocean. And Daedalus has to continue on without his son. So for me, the myth as it was originally told, the character of Icarus is a very common analogy for the kind of mental illness that I live with, which is bipolar. This idea of not being able to fly too high is very similar to like experiencing mania or a manic episode, having racing thoughts, having no ideas not really make sense. And the idea of flying low is a good analogy for being depressed and like feeling unmotivated, having a hard time getting out of bed and doing your day. And so for my whole adult life, I've had this analogy of Icarus and bipolar. So I've always felt drawn to that. But there's a problem for me with the original myth, which is that the allegory is basically just listen to your father, otherwise you won't achieve adulthood. I suppose that's like what it boils down to. And I don't think that that's a very relatable allegory for a lot of young people and specifically young men in the world today. People who have complicated relationships with our fathers and the values that they had, the things they taught us. In a lot of senses, they're not equipping us for being our best selves. They're not equipping us for surviving and thriving. And so for me, it was quick to just reimagine the myth. It was important to reimagine the myth and retell it so that they set forth from the labyrinth, but that it's not Icarus who falls. It's actually his father Daedalus who gives up and falls into the ocean, and he leaves his son aloft and stranded and having to deal not just with the grief at losing his dad, but also the reality of being on these wings that are his dad's legacy, and that they're a fundamentally flawed contrivance. And he has to not only mourn the loss that he experienced, but he has to find new ways to continue on and new ways to fly. And so that was the myth, that was the story. In order to give myself the resources to compose the album, I knew I needed to be a better composer than I was at that time. And so I reached out to this wonderful composer named Elisa Chung, and we started doing weekly mentorship sessions where we would get together and we would look at the kind of modern classical repertoire, and we would do active listening and reflecting on the techniques that were used. We went through everything from like 12-tone serialism to contemporary music. Elisa mostly composes for contemporary classical. And that was kind of a fast track to gain the knowledge that I needed. Because for the most part, my entire musical experience, I'm entirely self-taught. I took some piano lessons until I was like 11 or 12. And then I continued on teaching myself. and same with being a composer. Luckily, it's relatively very easy, or it's easier than it's ever been to do the kind of autodidactic trajectory as a composer. You can learn so many things on YouTube, on social media, even TikTok. I find TikTok is it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because you can get into the doom scroll, but at the same time, it really does distill value, or it distills ideas into their most quick and digestible and punchy formats. And so if you can find your best recipe for being on TikTok, for me, it's 15 minutes. I have 15 minutes of scrolling. And what I try and do is I try and capture 3, 4, 5 techniques, 3, 4, 5 things that I want to explore. And then I write them down, and then I go right away to more long form delivery. So I go and I research them on YouTube. And then the last step for me is implementing it. So whatever it is that I've learned, whatever it is that I've investigated and explored, I want to make sure that I do something with that idea, even if it's just a simple thought exercise. So. Sounds like a day. Yeah.
That's good. That's really good.
All right. Where do I still need to go with talking about the...
I'm curious with the in the initial research, with the reverse piano, have this sort of sense of arrival that you got from the piano.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if that loops back to the myth.
Oh yeah. Thanks for Yeah, totally.
There we go.
Yeah. So the direction that. So I got the funding from Canada Council to do the research project, which was a very sort of validating experience at that stage in my process. Mm-hmm. And what the arrival turned into is these moments in the album where sometimes I would refer to them as sound walls, or cinematic orchestrations, these parts where this small string ensemble that we put together gets filled out to be 30 or more voices, and it's just sort of, it maps onto these points where the music is the reverse piano is arriving into these chords, into the biggest chords in the songs that they're built on, and then on top of that is these string voices, which just carry, and they're not very long moments of time, they're maybe 10 or 20-second aspects of the song, but for sure there was a persistent theme of arrival. I would say specifically the track where it the most literally mapped on to that reverse piano that was giving me that feeling. It's in The Art of Flying, where the cello theme leads into the big orchestral exposition. And to me, that's sort of the pinnacle of the album, or the climax. Or for sure, it's Icarus's full expression of wellness. That was the one other sort of creative dynamic in the album, is that the height of Icarus flying, as it does represent emotional wellness for me, that also often would be reflected in the pitch of the instruments, the frequency of the instruments. So when the cello's playing down low, you're close to the water, and when the violin does its soaring heights, then it's that's coming up towards the sun. So yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, I have a lot more to say about the album, but maybe we should shift into that.
Well, why don't you say a couple other bullet points solo?
Yeah.
Just in the event that you like the way that it delivers on Lux.
Yeah.
And then we'll move on to the group.
Yeah.
Do you have more points?
Yeah. Well, I guess.
But don't worry about reusing it, because it'll come across different.
Sure. I guess I would say that that first step of reaching out to Elisa, mm-hmm. to teach me. Like that felt like putting myself out there. There's this like thing that people like experience. I think it's pretty a common experience for us, which is like imposter syndrome. And like historically, especially with music, I felt a little bit like unworthy of my music because I didn't go to the conservatory. I didn't like. I don't have this kind of like education pedigree that like other composers do have. But there's a thing with the Icarus album. It's like I wasn't doing these things for me. I was doing it for the album. And it was like almost like I could take chances on this album because it almost existed on its own, like external to me. And so when I reached out to Elisa, I was reaching out because that's what the album needed. And then after I connected with Elisa, I ended up connecting with like some like really wonderful, very accomplished classical musician soloists who played on the album. And every step of the way, not to mention Devin, the producer, who I literally sent a cold email to as he was on a boat one summer. And it was just like, I ended up building a weekly practice of like, I called it Cold Call Mondays, where I was just like, who are the 3 to 5 people who will take this project to the next level? I'm just going to send them an email and introduce myself, my story, and see if they want to work together. And it built an album that it's so much better than I ever could have made on my own. And it elevated it to, probably one of the greatest things that I've ever done. It was very noteworthy that like I was able to do that and continually put myself out there because I felt like I was creating something that had its own destiny or something.
Do you feel like you were sort of able to you talk about imposter syndrome, which is a near universal experience when you go into something, deeply, I think, because you realize how much there is still to learn and what you don't know. Do you think because you were able to look at the Icarus album objectively, like it's sort of not you, but something you're creating, it was that approach that allowed you to have the humility to keep learning through the process? Like, I'm curious about, because there's a recognition that there's a lot more to learn, and instead of like being intimidated to the point where you don't take action on it, it's like it's exciting enough, like the prospect of pouring into something. So I'm curious about if that was it conscious, like the separation of this project and you, or was it that's just sort of how it is in hindsight?
No, I knew it was happening at the time. I was very aware. I don't historically sell myself. I don't historically push my own successes. But with the Icarus album, like it had to be better. Like I was creating something that was like a profound expression of like the chorus parts of myself. And so it had to be technically and like creatively like better than I was. So it was always a process of aspiration. And so that meant, and what that is that's a fight between this kind of like fake it till you make it notion versus like being genuine and vulnerable. Right. And that was a bit of a balancing act, but mostly it meant just going fully in the direction of vulnerability so that when I stood up in front of this ensemble of musicians who played on the biggest stages in the world, I had never conducted anyone ever. I didn't even know how to count them in properly because I misunderstood a YouTube tutorial. But so there's like this like tightrope walk there, not a tightrope walk. There's this thing where I needed to be fully vulnerable about where I was at, but I also had to sort of like inspire enough confidence in these people that they knew that I was going to take the project home and that I would actualize it. So it's like forever aspiring to be better, one step better, or 10 steps better. It's like the trending term is like 10x it. I was like, I just need to 10x everything. I need to 10x like the cello performance, so I'll get like a tremendously successful cellist like on the project, and she just like arrived, and the cello is the instrument of the album, which most directly maps to Icarus and his well-being, and it very is like a cello forward context of an album. And Sylvia Bottiglione, who played the cello throughout, she just brought so much beauty and passion to those voicings and those melodies. Yeah, and I think in the end, that aspirational quality works. Like now when I hear the project, when I hear it in its entirety, I'm like, I arrived.
Yeah.
Cool.
Nice. So the cold email Monday.
Yeah. Cold call Mondays.
Yeah, so because you knew that you had to bridge this gap of your ability to what you were aspiring to, that gave you just sort of like courage or the push to reach out to someone like Devin, who ended up being the producer.
Yeah.
It's quite remarkable in that sense.
Yeah, I honestly too, just to talk about the full spectrum of emotion, it wasn't all aspirational. Some of it was the fact that I did have this like recurring grief and despair. And like when you're mourning, when you're actively mourning, when you're holding kind of like torment, like daily, you don't care if someone doesn't like your project. You don't care, if someone hangs up on you. I didn't. It was cold email Monday, but like I called it cold call Monday. But so part of it was just that I was like, I was pretty frequently in those years like numb, not like day to day, but there would be many like bouts of weeks at a time where I would just feel kind of numb. Yeah. At one point, at one point in the recording, I was feeling very, very upset, and Anit, the other producer on the album, asked me a question, and I said, honestly, Anit, like, it's really hard to care about anything when I feel like this. And he just kind of kept eye contact, and he nodded, and then he just took decision making away for the next half hour, and then I could plug back in and find myself again. And I was like, yeah. So being transparent, being forward, and being vulnerable was like something that shaped this project. And also saying every step of the way, like, appeasing my ego is not on the to-do list. The only rule is like, it has to make the music better. And if it or that's rule number one. And I think we did it.
Yeah,
so,
beautiful.
Yeah.
Cool. Nice.
Gorgeous.
We good for that segment? That was pretty solid. Very well
Super solid.
Yeah.
Awesome.
You're a pro.
Yeah, seriously, you are pro. You're really good at talking about this.
Thank you.
Did you prepare quite a bit for this? No, you just know what you're talking about. Hey, it's really succinct.
Well, I
and
feel like we
concise.
spent a lot of time just organizing the heels.
And thinking about it, yeah. I also do, I do public speaking